What's up, good people? We made it to episode 4. Oh, I'm so blessed to be here because I talk to such cool people in between these episodes, and it's really an honor to try to compile the things that I've heard from folks about what it's like to ride, what it's like to drive in St. Louis, but beyond. You know what I mean? So grateful to all who have ridden with me lately, people who spend their time and share their thoughts with me. I think when it comes to cycling or being outside with folks, I don't think we realize how it's really just spending time with one another, right? In a particular context. So just want to bring that to the forefront because on this, my 4th episode, dispatch, if you will, this kind of downloading with my notes of things that people have said onto y'all, my beautiful listeners, community members. There's just such a beautiful dignity and kind of like distinguished energy that people who bike with confidence exude. And I have noticed that, a lot of the conversations between cars and bicyclists or people who drive cars, not conversations between cars, but people who drive cars, and, we kind of turn into drivers instead of people who are maneuvering a vehicle. But those conversations, it can be hostile, right? It can be tense. And yet, obviously, cars have the power to help us move long distances in quick ways, in private ways. And then cycling, in my experience, has this beautiful opportunity for us to spend time with each other and see the world. And it's so weird to me that these conversations are so tense and kind of contradictory at times. So my hope with this We Belong in the Streets series and this episode in particular is that I would help to bridge some of those conversations, right? Because some bicyclists will never drive a car. And some drivers of cars will never bike, right? Will never experience the freedom of either world. And yet, we all share the same roads, right? And I know that one of the main things, too, that I want to speak to in this episode is just the reality that when a room of advocates or cyclists is, made with all of that same identity or one kind of identity, generally it's white folks, sometimes it's white men, sometimes it's white women. That's kind of generally the collective largest group that's represented oftentimes. And, anytime there's only one type of person in a room, you're going to get a general perspective. And as a black person who's often primarily ridden with other black people, but when it comes to advocacy and some of these legal, other types of rooms, protesty, policy type rooms, there aren't as many black transit advocates or people who have taken that conversation deeper into like those bigger boardrooms or those policy making spaces. So I really want to feel like I'm bringing the people that I ride with and the people that I spend my time outside of those rooms with. I want to bring concerns into those spaces. So that was kind of a long intro. But I say all of that to set up what is going to be a shorter episode. I'm going to tell you right now. I'm getting tighter. I'm getting more precise. My notes, I'm sorting through what I want to say. So thank you all for watching episodes 1 through 3. This particular episode could be a standalone. I think they all will build on each other well, though. And the first 3 episodes, I have them here in front of me, were the landscape. I wanted to just paint the picture of why I'm here. So go back and watch that if you haven't already. The second one was the trials. Like, okay, here's a landscape, but what are some of the things that we've gone through, or what are the things that we have had to swim through? Even I'll speak to myself, right? To even have the desire to share more, or to say what is something we are against, or things that keep us from having things as we'd like them, right? So that was the second episode. I recorded that while I was in California in the Bay Area visiting family. Third episode was the last one about community. I think community has changed a lot in the last several years, and so I really kind of try to tackle the range of what it has meant and looked like and how it drives me to show up. So this episode is going to be about the safety, the kind of safety conversation that is related to being in the streets versus on the sidewalk versus not ever wanting to drive or ride a bike, or the tension between kind of those two communities and identities. I'm also new to trying to emote on a camera, and the first 3 episodes were a little tech-checky complex, but this one, in addition to mostly going well, I'm also trying to record more than once. Shout out to the dual shot recorder app by the dude with the squirrel homies. I forget his name, but he's brilliant, and it was all the rage on Threads earlier this year. I'm going to try and use it today. And then I got my good old MacBook Air and my the vertical off from the dual shot recorder app. So technically I'm gonna have 3 versions of this video, and I'm just gonna try to make it look as fun and exciting to engage with as possible. Shout out to CapCut and all these apps we use to make this work. But yeah, so I'm gonna keep it moving, and I think the main things I want y'all to walk away with on this from this episode is that the way that we interact with the streets, the kind of assumption that they'll be dangerous or that we should drive kind of wild just because it's justified to get home as safely and as in one piece as possible. I think the main thing I want folks watching this or listening to this to take away is that the streets are not guaranteed to be dangerous. People do difficult or dangerous maneuvers on the roads, but ultimately we can and have more power than we think. We can shape our conditions as it relates to driving and biking and moving our bodies through public space. And I say that because I think that's the overall takeaway from the episode, but it's also, I feel inundated sometimes with like crash reports and negative realities that we've lived through, or that some of us have had folks not live through. Traffic accidents, vehicular violence, like there's a lot there. And I think, no one conversation on safety is going to touch it all. But like I mentioned in my kind of longer intro, what makes and sets me apart, what makes my perspective different, I think, is that I believe in us to create a different set of conditions. And I believe in our ability to collectively and individually embody a new way so that we all can play a part. It's kind of like voting, right? Like I think we agree or there's some collective thread that if we all do our part when it comes to voting, if people vote, people do their research, help their friends vote, that we can shape our conditions. Many people don't believe that, but that's the premise, right? And then I think the same thing applies to roads, but it's not as representative or sexy as a one-time thing, right? It's actually the opportunity to embody anew. It's the opportunity to show up differently and hope and pray that it pays off both in how we personally experience space, but also in keeping our friends, loved ones, neighbors safe. So that's the premise of this episode. And I want to build on something I talked about in the last 3 episodes, which is postures, right? And I think that's part of how you become different, is like you consider, how do I hold my body differently in the process? And when you think about a posture, you think about like sitting up straight in general. It's just good posture, right? But something that I really enjoyed learning from Prentice, who y'all should check out their podcast, Finding Our Way, or Becoming the People is what it is now. Both titles speak highly to their purpose around giving us kind of collective essences to pull from. And I enjoyed their transformative character, like embodiment training from a couple years ago that I did, that really just talks about postures. And so as I approach this episode, I'm pulling from that thread because, not only is Prentice a somatic coach, teacher, incredible speaker, mentor to me in my mind, but also they encourage us. And I think the collective energy from that, the takeaway from that training I went to, was that we could just kind of go home standing up straighter, and that the dignity was inherent in a way that sometimes in our oppressive or oppression-based conversations we lose, or it becomes like a faux pas to talk about how oppression is not the only frame or posture we can use to describe the world. And as a cyclist who, I hope to stay safe, I don't want to prioritize in my mind the crash reports or the data about how violent the roads are. Similarly, I want to bring that same opportunity to be embodied, to be powerful, that I learned at this workshop and at this series of trainings that I did with Prentice and Squad at the Embodiment Institute. I want to bring that here, right? Like as a listener, my prayer, my hope is that you would leave from listening to this reflection, knowing and noticing where you could do your part to be more attentive, to be more reflective of your responsibility when it comes to being on the road. And I say that as a cyclist, and as a hope all pedestrians, drivers would just be able to do their part, our part, to make our roads safer. Call it a pipe dream. But that's the takeaway, right? But I had 2 sub points that I really wanted to get at that I think make my brain make clear like what I'm bringing that's different. And the postures conversation, I just want to close that introduction piece where essentially the first 3 episodes I talked about how, the landscape, I pointed out that like it's a landscape often framed by discontent. Like what are we upset about together, or what are we in opposition about together? as opposed to like, what are we for, right? Which is, I think I've mentioned Mamdani in every episode because he's such a new framework for people to say, not only are we for XYZ, but we're going to get as far as we can and celebrate what we did about X, and we're going to celebrate what we can do about Y, and of course, keep working on Z. And so there's this frame of, or I'd say posture, right? That is something that is worth pulling from my entire generation. It's not just New York City. It's not just progressives or socialists. It's something that can apply to everyone. That what are we excited about, or do we feel are we capable of, and how can we then celebrate the journey to that instead of just prioritize the watchful frame of like what's not being done, right? So if we acknowledge that the landscape is kind of a posture of discontent, oftentimes we acknowledge that in the trials I mentioned that it's like a posture of demand, right? Like something's happened to us, we then demand or send out a list of demands. Many of us come from like a protest era of my age, 36, 37. Like at this time I'm 37. But like, in the last 10 years, making demands, and even of course the ancestors we come from made demands in their time, but in our time, that's a particular posture that I thought was interesting and worth naming. Because, we don't always get what we want, but it's been a formative approach and attempt at creating anew, So, and then the third community episode was how I talked about how community brings like a posture of dignity, or, we can talk about that posture in relationship to what community does for us and how it helps us root into our dignity, right? So the 2 points like are underneath the kind of larger topic of what posture could we bring to safety, or how do I describe when people talk about safety, what posture kind of comes to mind? And you might have noticed already, but all my postures have D letters. Shout out to Domino. Very on theme. But so the posture that I had in mind for safety is one of detainment, right? And I say that because when I think about safety, I think about police, I think about abolition, I think about the conversation that my generation has been responsible for, which is like, how do we keep each other safe, knowing that these systems aren't always something we can actually trust to keep us, quote unquote, safe. And so because we have this frame of detainment, like we have to arrest, right? Or we have to be punitive to fix an issue after the fact. A big part of what I'm trying to encourage or help us to consider on this listening opportunity, this episode, is to recognize how could we move from like detainment to direction and being determined to have something a certain way as opposed to just reacting after the fact. So I just wanted to introduce that postures thread because it's been really nice to me. I might try and find a way to put them on the screen or something, because it's been nice to have as an idea to say like, why am I talking about each of these, and how is what I see summarized, how can I bring a different approach that you can walk away with feeling equipped or feeling curious about this framework that we could like notice. It's like having a fish describe water, right? You're like, it's everywhere. I don't know how to describe it. Everything's based on the fact that it just is there. And I think the same thing about belonging or being safe on our streets. There's something about if we just name things, we could approach it differently and more collectively. So the 2 points, like I said, are I want y'all to walk away being a part of change, or feeling like you can be a part of the change. And I'll mention a little bit more about that. And then I want to redirect, as I just kind of mentioned, and I'm just compiling them separately, redirect our conversations from not just reactivity or fear, but from, fear to preparedness, right? And to make it like to talk about how prepared we feel to do things better, differently, improved, create improved conditions. I want that for us. So when I think about the fact that safety can mean many things, when it comes to the cycling world, there's this like vision zero framework, I suppose. I haven't studied it deeply, but it's just, I understand it to be this context where it's like our goal is to make it so that no one dies, right? It's vision zero, no death, zero traffic deaths, zero severe injuries. And because I'm not a practiced scholar on this particular framework, I just wanted to mention it because I think there's something about the tools that we have, the ways we talk about our goals that are important to bring in. And then when it comes to what I want to see, like I'm going to tell a quick story of context here in St. Louis, right? St. Louis has a pretty active cycling scene, I'd say. It's pretty white, but there are groups of people, pockets of non-white folks who are engaging. in the sport and recreational activity. But when I go to these advocate meetings or have conversations with other cyclists, a lot of them, you know, are often avowed abolitionists. They want to not have to deal with the police as a way to making our roads and cities and communities safer, which I really am grateful for. And I think it's a beautiful outcome of some of our organizing, those of us who have been a part of abolitionist conversations in this last decade. To have just regular everyday people be like, I don't want to involve police is a big deal. But then you have folks who work with kids or other, more vulnerable road users, community members who are strong advocates, right? Or just people in general who really want to see the police called. And in St. Louis, there's been a really big schism, I'd say, between those two communities because we're in an era where a lot of our roads are being repaved thanks to like the Biden Infrastructure Act and just other national and federal funding or even local funding that's being applied to updating our roads in this particular era. I know here in St. Louis, I think it's 5 arterial roads have been updated. I keep these types of mobility, investment, urban planning, meeting images back. This is my qualifications. But, so when you see these updated roads, it can, for some, feel like, oh, more safety. Because instead of dealing with police, you're creating infrastructure that will essentially make it impossible to be a dangerous road user, right? That's the goal. Put things in your way so you have to drive more safely or maneuver more safely. And so while, there's a frustration sometimes associated with that, I commend those who are able to see safety in that way and are working on using that definition of safety where we make it impossible for our folks to hurt other people or put other people in dangerous situations. That's the first goal, right? And I think that's a beautiful example of how abolition is bigger than just kind of not calling the police. It's actually a structural commitment. And I say that too because I live on a calm street in St. Louis. And that means that, it's a alternative to like a main street, if you will, a big, busy arterial road. Excuse me. And so I've watched people have to behaviorally adjust to these little islands in the road or to, poles and just cement where it wasn't before. And it's hard, it's been like 4 years. So I've been watching people adjust, but it has shifted, right? The changes in the street really take a minute to get used to, but it's powerful to see them start to work better. And, I say that I mentioned the advocates being like one type of group of people because in those advocate meetings, we talk about safety a lot. And I just know that when Black folks talk about safety, we mean something different than a lot of times when white people talk about safety. There is there's such a universal definitions, but as a person who doesn't often feel or see the same type of threat that some of those folks in those rooms are talking about because they're predominantly white, and I think that's a particular experience that they're having. What I would say that my folks that I've talked about and the people who I am in a relationship with, either cycling or just in community, when they say safety, they really mean, protection from harm and protection, not just the detainment or the after the fact piece, right? So I say that because one, I want to honor and acknowledge that it does take time to get used to new roads and things that are in our way that weren't there before. But I commend those advocates and those folks who have been working to structurally shift and make possible new successes. And then, I want to just leave us with the vision of like, how can we all make it possible or more guaranteed for others around us to succeed at what we want to see them do or what we want to do with them. And so being a part of change, I think as a road user, it can feel like you're in your own world, in your own car, on your own bike. But it's a beautiful thing to basically consider how much we are doing our part. And so I just encourage y'all to at least listen, if you listen this far, to consider what your part could be. And then the last element of this that I wanted to say is that I want to redirect the conversation from fear to preparedness. So with our bike classes, that's something I'm doing. With how I ride and who I ride with, I try to, have a helmet and create a culture of we're prepared should anything happen. Ideally, we don't want anything to happen to us, but we're prepared to be safe or prepared to address the situation, travel with a first aid kit, things like that. And really, those are the kind of main things I want to speak to because I think there's an accountability that I feel about considering the safety of my community and, of course, my own body when I'm moving through space. But I just look forward to this conversation reaching further beyond some of these rooms with these advocate maps and these things where not everybody's going to get to go to these little report outs and have time to read this very little font. But as somebody who has gone to those spaces, and, you know, hopes to share as much of the resources that I've found that have helped me feel safe, I hope that these ideas get your thoughts moving, your considerations about how you can show up better in your community. Hope that all starts to sort itself out just from listening. And then I wanted to highlight this. I know for each other episode I've been talking about either an ancestor or an affirmation that the episode is kind of grounded in. And today being election day here in St. Louis, August 4th, it is, an important thing to vote. This is a really difficult time to even exercise your own voting rights. Things are being more complicated. I know folks have been caught off the rolls. And so I just wanted to mention, I'm not going to read this whole text, but I really wanted to highlight essentially the story that is the inspiration, one of the inspirations for Fly By Bike. This text is the title story in this collection called The People Could Fly. The People Could Fly. Goes way back. It's one of those just fairy tales, folk tales that gets passed down in different formats. And I'm going to read the first paragraph, but that's it. And then we're going to start to close it up. So hopefully y'all can find it online or come to a class and I'll tell you more. We are having Fly By Bike classes this August 10th, 17th, and 24th. Come get ready to go back to school, help your kids commute more, get yourself ready for the road. We want to be there for you. All right, this folktale is called The People Could Fly. This paragraph is the opening to the story. The people could fly. They say the people could fly. Say that long ago in Africa, some of the people knew magic, and they would walk up on the air like climbing up on a gate. And they flew like blackbirds over the fields, black, shiny wings flapping against the blue up there. Then, many of the people were captured for slavery. The ones that could fly shed their wings. They couldn't take their wings across the water on the slave ships. Too crowded, don't you know? The folks were full of misery then, got sick with the up and down of the sea, so they forgot about flying when they could no longer breathe the sweet scent of Africa. Actually, I'm going to read one more small paragraph because I think this is a good enough tidbit to keep you curious about what the rest of the story says, or at least see how it might show up in our world. Say the people who could fly kept their power, although they shed their wings. They kept their secret magic in the land of slavery. They looked the same as other people from Africa who had been coming over who had dark skin. Say you couldn't tell anymore one who could fly from one who couldn't. I'll leave it there, but shout out to Leo and Diane Dillon for their illustrations and Virginia Hamilton for her diligence in helping us make sure these stories get told. As you can see, that is the background image for this first round of Fly By Bike shirts. Just really speaking to the fact that we can change our conditions at any time. So this is a little bit of a shorter video. Hopefully you get to thinking about what safety looks like for you, what Vision Zero might look like for your community, and also how to keep people safe who are not just cyclists or drivers, but really, require safety in a way that acknowledges the many different ways we use our roads and streets, whether that's going between our families' houses, going to and from work, or just being people who deserve the dignity of having their homes and their cities and their streets rebuilt after, for example, the tornado in St. Louis 1 year ago. Giving thanks, y'all, for your ears, the ability to listen and speak, and the technology to share this message with you. Happy summer, happy August from Domino and I look forward to my last episode in September, episode 5, which will be about solutions. Some of that will include what we've learned from our primary day today and just what it means to do work on a collective scale and find solutions together. So thank you for tuning in. See you in the streets.